Welcome back to the Daily Crypto Deep Dive. Over the last 4 episodes, we've followed the long and often forgotten path that led to Bitcoin. We started with digital cash systems that worked technically, but depended on banks and disappeared when those banks walked away. We moved through gold-backed digital money that scaled globally, only to collapse the moment custody and regulation collided. We explored the cypherpunk ideas that came painfully close to solving the problem: proof of work, decentralized ledgers, cryptographic scarcity, but still fell short when theory met real human behavior. And finally, we arrived at the moment Bitcoin launched, quietly and deliberately, removing every known point of failure that had destroyed everything before it. This final episode is about what that survival means, not just for Bitcoin, but for money itself. By the time Bitcoin survived its first decade, the debate had quietly shifted. It was no longer about whether the system worked. It was no longer about whether the code was sound. It wasn't even about whether governments approved of it or not. The question had become something far more uncomfortable for critics and institutions alike. Why was it still here? History is ruthless with bad ideas. It doesn't argue with them. It doesn't negotiate. It simply removes them. Technologies that don't solve real problems fade away. Systems that rely on fragile assumptions collapse under pressure. Movements that depend on charisma or belief alone burn out once enthusiasm wanes. Bitcoin had been through every environment designed to kill it: indifference, ridicule, hostility, internal conflict, and external pressure. And yet it remained. That survival is the most important thing about Bitcoin. Because nothing else in this story survived. Digital cash existed before Bitcoin, but it depended on banks and disappeared when those banks lost interest. Gold-backed digital money scaled before Bitcoin, but collapsed the moment custody and regulation collided. Cypherpunk ideas mapped the terrain brilliantly, but stalled at the point where theory met human behavior. Every prior attempt failed at a specific fault line, and Bitcoin was designed explicitly to remove those fault lines. That design is the real story. Bitcoin doesn't survive because people believe in it. It survives because it doesn't require belief at all. It doesn't ask participants to trust an issuer, a company, a vault, or a promise. It asks them to verify rules and follow incentives. That distinction is subtle, but it changes everything. In Bitcoin, trust is replaced by structure. Anyone can leave. Anyone can fork. Anyone can run the software or ignore it entirely. There is no authority that can compel participation, and no mechanism that can force compliance beyond economic reality. If you follow the rules, the system rewards you. If you don't, it ignores you. That indifference is its strength. This is why Bitcoin behaves so differently from other systems. When companies fail, executives are blamed. When banks fail, governments intervene. When platforms fail, users migrate. But when Bitcoin faces stress, nothing steps in to save it. And nothing needs to. The system doesn't pause. It doesn't ask for bailouts. It doesn't rewrite the rules in response to pressure. Blocks continue to be produced. Transactions continue to settle. The ledger continues to grow. That continuity is not accidental. It's the result of removing every discretionary lever from the system. There is no committee that can decide to inflate the supply. No emergency authority that can freeze balances. No executive decision that can override the protocol. Changes require broad consensus, and consensus is deliberately difficult to achieve. That friction isn't inefficiency, it's protection. Bitcoin is slow on purpose. Speed benefits controllers, slowness benefits resilience. This is where many people misunderstand Bitcoin's role. They judge it by the standards of payment apps, venture-backed startups, or financial products. But Bitcoin isn't trying to be agile. It's trying to be dependable. It's not optimized for user growth or feature velocity. It's optimized for one thing: continuing to exist under adverse conditions. And that optimization has consequences. Because a system that can't be stopped eventually becomes something institutions have to react to, rather than control. Over time, Bitcoin forced banks, regulators, and governments into an uncomfortable position. They could ignore it when it was small. They could mock it when it was volatile. They could warn against it when it was misunderstood. But once it reached a certain scale, ignoring it stopped being an option. This is the difference between protest and infrastructure. Protests can be suppressed. Infrastructure has to be accommodated. Bitcoin never asked to replace the financial system. It never demanded adoption. It never promised stability or convenience. It simply existed, offering an alternative that anyone could use and no one could monopolize. That quiet persistence changed the conversation. Instead of asking, should Bitcoin exist? Institutions began asking, how do we deal with the fact that it does? That shift is profound. It explains why Bitcoin attracts such polarized reactions even now. People don't argue this fiercely about failed technologies. They argue when something threatens to outlast them. Bitcoin challenges assumptions that modern finance relies on, not through ideology, but through demonstration. It shows that money can exist without an issuer, that value can be transferred without permission, that scarcity can be enforced without physical custody. Those are not opinions. They are observable facts, and once something is proven possible, it can't be unproven. This is why Bitcoin's origin story matters so much. It wasn't just the first cryptocurrency to succeed. It was the first system to internalize every lesson history had already taught digital money. Remove the center. Remove discretion. Remove trust. Remove dependency. Bitcoin didn't try to fix finance. It sidestepped it. And by doing so, it created a parallel system that operates under entirely different assumptions. In traditional finance, stability comes from authority. In Bitcoin, stability comes from constraints. In traditional systems, trust is granted. In Bitcoin, it is unnecessary. That inversion is why Bitcoin is so difficult to categorize. It isn't a company. It isn't a product. It isn't a movement. It's closer to a natural phenomenon than a business. Like the internet itself, it doesn't belong to anyone, and that's precisely why it survives. This also explains why Bitcoin resists change so stubbornly. Critics often argue that it should evolve faster, add features, adapt to trends. But adaptability is not always a virtue. In systems of power, rigidity can be protection. Bitcoin's resistance to change prevents capture. It ensures that no single group can reshape it to serve narrow interests. And that makes it boring. Intentionally boring. Which is exactly what money should be. If you zoom out far enough, Bitcoin's story stops being about technology and starts being about incentives and power. Every previous form of digital money failed because someone, somewhere, had the power to intervene. Bitcoin survives because no one does. That doesn't make it perfect. It doesn't make it immune to risk. It doesn't make it inevitable. But it makes it resilient in a way no previous system ever was. And resilience compounds. Each year Bitcoin survives, it becomes harder to kill. Each crisis it endures strengthens its credibility. Each failed attempt to regulate it out of existence clarifies its nature. Over time, the question stops being whether Bitcoin will survive, and becomes what people choose to build around it. That is where we are now. The 5-part story you've just heard isn't about nostalgia or technical trivia. It's about understanding why this system exists at all. Bitcoin wasn't an accident. It wasn't a fluke. It was the outcome of decades of failed experiments, refined ideas, and painful lessons. Digital money existed before Bitcoin. It failed. Gold-backed digital money scaled before Bitcoin. It collapsed. Decentralized ideas emerged before Bitcoin. They stalled. Bitcoin succeeded because it combined everything those systems learned and removed everything that had killed them. That's the real origin of cryptocurrency. And it's why Bitcoin still matters, regardless of price, cycles, or headlines. Because it represents something that had never existed before. A monetary system that doesn't care who you are, where you live, or what you believe, and doesn't need to. It simply works. That's it for this series. If you've stayed with us through all 5 parts, you now understand Bitcoin in a way most people never will. Not as a chart, not as a trade, but as a system shaped by history. Leave your thoughts in the comments, hit follow if you're new, and thank you for listening all the way through. And as always, we will see you at the top.